In today's battlefield, the most frightening change is not just that soldiers are being hit. It is that almost nothing now looks safe for long. A house is no longer just a shelter. A trench is no longer just cover. A tank covered for protection is no longer guaranteed to survive. And even the road behind the front is starting to look like part of the kill zone. That is what makes this story so disturbing. What is happening around Pokrovsk is not only a series of Russian losses caught on drone cameras. It is a warning that the old idea of survival on the battlefield is breaking down under a sky that keeps watching, keeps following, and keeps striking. The real shock is not one explosion, one vehicle, or one failed attempt to hide. The real shock is that more and more parts of the battlefield now seem connected by the same deadly pattern. And once that pattern becomes clear, the meaning of every movement begins to change. Stay with military force because the real story is not only what Russia is losing near the front, but what these drone strikes reveal about how modern war is being rewritten. The first and most important change here is that a roof no longer means safety. A group of Russian soldiers tried to hide inside houses and shallow field shelters after being spotted from above, but those positions were struck within minutes, and the speed of that sequence says more than the explosions themselves. What once looked like the most basic way to stay alive on the battlefield now looks weak against a system that can find movement, pass coordinates fast, and send FPV drones straight onto the target before the men inside can recover their balance. That matters because survival used to depend on reaching cover first. Now survival depends on whether that cover has already been seen, tracked, and marked for destruction. That is why the story becomes more serious the moment those first shelters collapse. The deeper problem is that these were not hardened bunkers built to survive repeated hits. They were damaged houses, rough positions, and temporary hiding places near the line, which means they were only useful as long as the enemy could not see what was happening inside. Once a reconnaissance drone stayed overhead, that old logic began to fail. A small movement near a doorway, a figure shifting in a broken room, or even a quick attempt to settle inside could be enough to trigger the next strike. In that kind of environment, the time between being noticed and being hit becomes dangerously short. The battlefield then stops giving soldiers time to think, and starts forcing them into a race they are unlikely to win. That is where the pressure begins to change the meaning of every later movement. This also changes the mental condition of Russian infantry in a very direct way. The danger is no longer limited to open ground, roads, or exposed trenches. It follows them into the places that once felt like a pause between threats. A soldier who reaches a ruined house should feel that he has at least bought a little time. But under constant aerial surveillance, that feeling becomes harder to trust. The body may stop running, but the fear does not stop with it, because the men inside know that hiding is no longer the same as disappearing. They may be alive for the moment, but they also know that a drone team could already be adjusting the angle for the final hit. That kind of pressure wears down judgment, weakens discipline, and makes every decision feel rushed, which is why the problem does not end with one destroyed shelter. What is emerging here is a wider rule about modern combat near the front. When drones cover the air above ruined villages and shallow positions, concealment becomes thinner, time becomes shorter, and simple field survival becomes much harder than it once was. That is why this is not just another clip of soldiers being caught in a bad place. It is evidence that near Pokrovsk and similar sectors, hiding has started to lose the value it once had. On a battlefield shaped by drones, taking cover no longer guarantees a move from danger to safety. Very often, it only marks the moment when a man stops running in the open and starts waiting inside a place that has already been turned into a target. And that is exactly why the pressure does not stop at the walls. Another serious shift is that even basic protection and frontline support are being worn down at the same time. One Russian tank was left on the road with anti-drone netting already attached. Yet an FPV pilot still found a weak point and hit it. And that image says a great deal about where this war is going. The extra covering was not useless, because nets and metal frames can still reduce some attack angles and force a drone operator to make a harder approach. But that is no longer enough to promise survival when the pilot is skilled. The camera is clear, and the strike comes with patience instead of panic. What matters here is not only that a tank was destroyed. What matters is that a defense method designed to buy time is now being tested by crews that know how to circle, study, and exploit even a small opening. That changes the meaning of passive protection. It can still delay a hit, but it is becoming less reliable as a final answer. And once that becomes true for armored vehicles, the pressure begins to spread toward everything around them. That is where the battlefield starts to look even more dangerous. The same drone threat is not stopping at tanks or other high-value targets. It is also reaching the smaller support links that keep Russian units working near the front. Communication antennas were hit. Small supply points were struck. Light vehicles and quad bikes carrying stores toward forward positions were found and attacked. These are not dramatic targets in the classic sense because they do not carry the same visual weight as a tank in flames. But their loss can damage a fighting unit in quieter and more lasting ways. A destroyed antenna can weaken coordination. A lost vehicle can delay food, water, ammunition, batteries, and medical items. A quad bike that never reaches the line may seem minor from far away, yet at the front it can mean one more position waiting longer for what it needs. So the real damage is not only what burns on camera, because the deeper effect is felt in how a unit keeps functioning after those links begin to disappear. This is why the pattern matters more than any single strike. Ukraine is not only hunting expensive machines, it is also cutting into the system that allows Russian troops close to the line to communicate, move supplies, and stay in the fight from 1 hour to the next. That kind of pressure is dangerous because it works layer by layer. The first hit may destroy a vehicle. The second may reduce contact between positions. The third may slow resupply to the point where men at the front begin rationing what should have arrived already. None of this needs to happen in one giant blow. It becomes effective because many smaller losses start stacking on top of each other until the unit feels weaker in every direction. That is how drone warfare turns from a weapon of attack into a weapon of erosion. And once erosion begins, the front does not collapse all at once, because it starts losing strength piece by piece. So the cost of these strikes should not be measured only by how many vehicles were damaged or how much equipment was left burning beside the road. The larger cost is that Russian combat power near the front is being worn down one support layer at a time. Fire destroys the visible target, but disruption weakens everything behind it. And that is why the strain soon reaches the men still trying to move into position. A front begins to weaken much faster when replacement troops are hit before they even reach the line. That is what makes these drone strikes on Russian rotation groups so important. Several small groups were spotted while moving toward fighting positions, and they were attacked on the way instead of at the final point, which means the damage began before those men could even join the battle they were sent to support. This matters because a rotation is not just movement. It is the process that keeps a front alive. Fresh troops are supposed to relieve tired soldiers, carry supplies, fill gaps, and restore some order after constant pressure. But when reinforcements are stopped in the middle of the route, the loss is bigger than the number of men killed or wounded. The deeper problem is that the soldiers already holding the line do not get relief on time. They stay exposed longer, they carry more stress, and they face the next wave of danger while already worn down. That is how a delay on the road can become a weakness at the trench. The source material makes that picture even clearer. Some Russian troops were moving with large backpacks, trying to reach positions through open ground or along routes that were already being watched from above. That detail matters because it shows these were not troops moving freely across safe rear areas. They were entering a dangerous corridor where every step had to be timed well, and where even a short pause could become fatal. A man carrying extra weight cannot move fast forever. A group crossing a bare stretch cannot disappear on command. And once a drone team already knows the route, the journey becomes less like movement and more like exposure measured in minutes. That changes the battlefield in a very direct way. The danger no longer begins only when troops arrive at the front. It begins while they are still trying to get there. This is why this kind of strike is so effective. It attacks combat power before combat power is fully formed. Instead of waiting for Russian troops to settle into a trench, reinforce a strongpoint, or join an assault element, Ukrainian drone teams are hitting them during the most vulnerable stage of the process. That means the target is not just a soldier. The target is the arrival of manpower itself. In military terms, this is a blow against endurance. A force can take losses and still keep fighting for some time, but if it cannot rotate, it cannot recover in a normal rhythm. Tired men remain in place. Wounded positions stay under strength. Commanders lose flexibility. And every new day begins with fewer good options than the day before. That is why roads and approach routes near sectors like Pokrovsk now matter so much. Pressure is no longer concentrated only at one trench line or one ruined village. It stretches across the paths that connect the rear to the front. So the old idea that danger starts only after troops reach the position is becoming much less true. Now the road itself can be part of the battle. The field before the trench can be part of the battle. Even the final few hundred meters before arrival can decide whether a unit becomes stronger or weaker. Once rotation starts breaking along the approach route, the front does not only lose men. It begins to lose its ability to restore itself after each clash. And that is when the strain starts reaching systems that were supposed to protect the line from above. Another major shift is that drones are no longer stopping with infantry and vehicles because they are now starting to peel open air defense itself. That is why the reported strikes on Tor M1 systems matter so much. A Tor is not a secondary target. It is one of the key layers meant to protect troops and equipment from low-flying threats, including drones, guided bombs, and some other aerial weapons. In simple terms, it is part of the shield. So when that shield is hit by the very kind of threat it was built to stop, the meaning goes far beyond one damaged launcher. According to the source material, one Tor M1 can cost around $25 to $30 million. The crew is small, around 4 people, and the system can track many targets at once, with some descriptions putting that number at up to 48. It can also engage threats out to about 12 kilometers. On paper, that sounds like a serious asset. But paper strength and battlefield survival are not always the same thing. The weakness appears when the target is small, low, slow, and approaching through the wrong angle at the wrong moment. That is where FPV drones begin to matter in a very different way. This is what changes the cost balance of the war. A relatively cheap drone can force a very expensive air defense system to show its limits. That does not mean every drone will get through. It does mean the attacker no longer needs a large missile or aircraft strike every time it wants to threaten a protected zone. Sometimes a much simpler tool can do the job if it is used with enough skill and patience. That is a serious problem for Russia, because a shield that must stay alert to many kinds of threats can still be exposed by the smallest one if that threat is hard to see until the last seconds. And once that happens more than once, the pressure spreads well beyond the air defense crew itself. The tactical meaning is even bigger. If short-range air defense near the front becomes weaker, then other Ukrainian actions become easier to carry out. Reconnaissance drones can stay in the air with less risk. Supply routes can be watched more closely. Support vehicles can be hunted with less interference. Approach roads can be monitored for longer periods. Even strikes deeper behind the line become more realistic because one protective layer has already been reduced or forced to pull back. In that sense, the target is not only the Tor. The target is the whole local protection network around it. That is why these attacks should not be read as isolated technical successes. They point to a larger battlefield trend. Drone teams are learning how to challenge not just exposed troops, but the systems designed to guard those troops. And once those systems begin to crack, the rest of the front becomes more vulnerable in ways that are not always visible in the first video clip. A burning launcher is dramatic, but the real damage may appear later when more drones pass through, more vehicles are found, and more positions lose the cover they thought they still had. So the role of drones is changing fast. They are not only tools for killing single targets on open ground. They are becoming instruments for stripping away one protective layer after another from an entire combat system. And when those layers start coming off, the battlefield does not just become more dangerous at the point of contact, because the same pressure begins spreading across the wider space around the front. Pokrovsk now shows something larger than a hard-fought sector, because it shows how the space around the front is turning into a zone of constant risk. Russian soldiers moving in this area are no longer traveling under the old battlefield logic, where danger begins mainly at the trench line or inside the main clash. They are moving under near constant watch from above, and that changes everything. A man crossing open ground, a small group trying to use a tree line, or troops searching for a temporary place to stop can all become targets very quickly if they are spotted at the wrong moment. That matters because exposure is no longer measured only by distance to enemy fire. It is measured by whether a drone has already seen the movement and whether a strike team is already being guided toward it. In that kind of environment, the sky becomes part of the battlefield every second, and the front starts extending far beyond the place where soldiers actually exchange fire. That is why Pokrovsk matters as more than one dangerous location, because it now helps show how the rules of survival are being changed across a much wider zone. The same pattern is affecting vehicles as well, and that makes the problem even more serious. This is no longer only about infantry caught in the open. Trucks, light vehicles, and small transport platforms moving toward the line are also being followed and attacked as they enter the most dangerous belt near the front. That has a direct impact on the rhythm of the war. If a truck is destroyed before it unloads, supplies do not arrive. If a light vehicle is hit on the approach road, the cargo inside never reaches the men waiting ahead. And if transport keeps being lost on the way in, the front begins to feel weaker even before a major attack begins. This is where drone warfare becomes more than a matter of destruction. It becomes a method of controlling movement itself. The source material describes a battlefield where several kilometers near the line have become extremely dangerous, and that is a very important point. A road does not need to sit inside direct artillery fire to become deadly anymore. It only needs to fall inside a zone where drone surveillance is active, target information moves fast, and strike platforms can respond before the vehicle finishes the final part of its route. That is why the rear edge of the battlefield no longer feels truly rear. The larger meaning is strategic as much as tactical. When both men and vehicles are placed under constant observation, the balance at the front is no longer decided only by how many troops are holding the first line. It is also decided by which side can still move safely, still deliver ammunition, still maintain contact between positions, and still rotate exhausted troops without losing them on the approach. A unit may look strong on paper because it has enough soldiers and enough equipment assigned to it. But if the roads are being watched, if supply runs are disrupted, if relief groups are cut down before arrival, and if local communications are repeatedly damaged, then that strength becomes much harder to turn into real battlefield effect. This is why the struggle around Pokrovsk should be read as a picture of a wider transformation. The battlefield is no longer only the trench, the ruined house, or the road intersection where the hit is filmed. It is the whole space around them, including the routes, the pauses, the waiting points, and the final kilometers before contact. All of this points to one reality. The area extending for many kilometers around the front is being saturated by drones, and once that happens, movement, concentration, resupply, and reinforcement all become extremely risky if detected. That is the real meaning of these strikes. The biggest change is not only that more targets are being destroyed, but that even the idea of safety behind the line is starting to disappear. Taken together, these strikes show far more than Ukraine's growing skill with drones. They show that the nature of war around Pokrovsk is changing in a deeper and more dangerous way. A soldier reaching a house may still be found. A tank covered with anti-drone protection may still be hit. A supply vehicle moving the last few kilometers to the front may still never arrive. Even an air defense system built to protect the battlefield can become vulnerable if its weakness is exposed at the wrong moment. That means drones are no longer just support weapons. They are becoming tools that shape the whole combat space, from movement and supply to protection and survival itself. And if this pattern keeps expanding, the bigger question will not only be how much Russia continues to lose. The bigger question will be how long any force can hold ground when the sky above it keeps turning distance, cover, and even rear areas into danger. Subscribe to Military Force for more.